So now that I have enumerated the progress of the international human rights system over the past 65 years, but more particularly in the past 20 years, I will rest for a moment on the peak of that great series of hills we have climbed and take a look at the horizon to see if I can make out some of the hills that lie ahead in the mist. One way to develop clarity about the human rights challenges of coming decades is to look at the great challenges that we are undergoing as a society. Globalization, terrorism, urbanization, and migration, and interlaced with all of these phenomena, the new communications universe that has transformed our lives, the internet. So let me address these issues briefly. First, globalization. Globalization of the market economy can have a positive impact on human rights by increasing standards of living and access to vital services such as education and healthcare. But the current sharp surge in transnational business has led to the development of increasingly global markets for human effort, natural resources, and capital, and these can involve human rights abuses, vividly summed up in the appalling term, disposable people. Displacement, environmental degradation, land grabs leading to increased poverty, it is evident that globalization can exacerbate gaps in many societies between rich winners and poor losers. These are formidable challenges, particularly thorny at a time of global recession, when the urge for rapid development may clash in a shrinking economy with urgent environmental concerns such as climate change. And therefore, I'm constantly urging countries who are adopting austerity measures in response to financial crises to put human beings at the center of those policies. Human rights do not disappear just because there's austerity, and governments do not suddenly drop their human rights obligations because they have to look at austerity measures. Now, together with their civil and political rights, all human beings have economic, social, and cultural rights. These are recognized and protected in international human rights instruments, and they include the right to decent education, to adequate housing, to a standard of living supportive of a life in dignity, and to adequate health care. United Nations member states have a legal obligation to protect economic, social, and cultural rights and to take progressive action towards their fulfillment. By now, you would see what Professor Jay Chun told us, that the South African Constitution very much reflects the international framework of rights, both civil and political and economic, social, and cultural rights. So regarding the trend of globalization, our challenge in coming years will be to continue to engage with business and regulators to discourage practices such as sweatshop conditions, environmental harm, and thoughtless development which damages the rights of many individuals, in particular indigenous peoples and the disadvantaged. Corporations must be helped to understand that truly sustainable profits come from policies that promote human rights, because the only really stable societies are those in which people enjoy lives that satisfy their need for dignity and freedom. And as we've all witnessed the uprisings in the Middle East and North Africa, we have seen this with our eyes. Shortly before the Tunisian uprising, a well-known international monetary body issued its report, giving a very glowing account of the situation in Tunisia. Wonderful economic growth, cost of living is not high, everything's well, and just a few days later, a man burned himself in protest against the fact that he couldn't find a job, and people took to the streets. And this is why I also am very pleased with the Human Rights Council, which, after many years of work, has now adopted guidelines on business and human rights, and very, very huge corporations have adopted those guidelines. Human rights principles and standards should be a yardstick that serves to assess economic policies. We must work to ensure that regulations promote more transparency regarding financial transactions. We need to enhance the accountability of corporations and ensure that governments too are accountable and respond to the needs of people in an inclusive and equitable manner, ensuring that the poor and the marginalized can also participate in the process of making decisions. I have issued statements and letters to various governments who have laws making their contracts with corporations on the extraction of natural resources an official secret. It should be the opposite: transparency, consultation, and in fact informed consent of indigenous peoples. This brings me to another challenge, and that is racism and hate speech. This is a second powerful trend, is urbanization and its related force, migration. Today, as you all know, 1/2 of the human beings on our planet live in cities, and these figures continue to surge. A very broad range of human rights may be affected by these phenomena, including the right to adequate and secure housing and living conditions. But for the purpose of this talk, I'd like to highlight a number of issues that touch on tolerance. When groups of people with diverse origins, languages, and practices suddenly find the distances between them have been compressed, their coexistence may be difficult. There may be racism or other forms of irrational prejudice which are in themselves intolerably unjust and which may also lead to violence. In the past 2 decades, hate speech, claims of hate speech, and violent reactions to perceived hate speech have created enormous friction across the globe. And this has led to some people challenging various forms of expression, which they perceive to be offensive or see as constituting incitement to intolerance and violence. On March 21st, which is the International Day Against Racism, commemorating South Africa's Sharpeville Day, I arranged for a focus on racism in sport and had some very famous footballers, particularly Prince Boateng, who walked off the football field, as you know, because of the racial chanting. And he came himself, and we had a whole lot of young football enthusiasts, and we had very, very wide coverage of this event. I have, obviously, coming from South Africa, always had my focus on discrimination of all sorts, but particularly racial discrimination. I raise them everywhere, whether I'm in Brazil, regarding the treatment of people of African descent, whether I was in Russia, where I interviewed a number of Africans and was appalled by the violence to which they are subjected. Now, back to freedom of expression. This is obviously, you'll agree, a vital cornerstone of democracy. It allows individuals to argue for their enjoyment of all other rights, from fair trials, freedom of religion, and free elections to decent living conditions. So, as a matter of fundamental principle, the limitation of any kind of expression must remain an exception. In the late 1990s, when I served as a judge on the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, I heard a case in which several individuals working in media organizations and the radio station had quite outright called for massacres, directly and publicly, inciting murder, with words such as, "See the ones with the small nose and break them." So because of cases like these, where speech can clearly lead to wrongful action, states are required under international law to prohibit certain forms of speech that incite violence and hatred. And this has been a very hot topic in my term in the last 5 years, because People have raised the question of Islamophobia. They've raised the question of defamation of religion. And I realize that something has to be done to bring the discourse under international law, because really you can't defame a religion, you can defame individuals. And after many years of work together with governments and member states, my office has recently helped create a detailed body of guidance known as the Rabat Plan of Action to help clarify what kinds of speech may be prohibited. This plan, which was developed over 2 years by experts around the world, and I mean around the world because we had 5 regional workshops with experts from the region. The plan recommends that criminal sanctions should be a last resort for situations that it clearly defines according to 6 thresholds. They include context, the speaker's standing, intent to advocate or incite, content, scope or extent, and imminence, the 5 criteria. In facilitating the development of this kind of guidelines, we seek to help people of different backgrounds, histories, and religions to live together in mutual tolerance and respect. Similarly, we recently convened a high-level panel to highlight the need to fight racism in sport. As I explained, this is a symbolically important issue. Professional athletes and sporting events play an important role in inspiring our children and teenagers. Bigotry of the kind that is too often displayed on professional football pitches is an affront to human rights, and it is illegal under international human rights law. I am insisting that event organizers must provide secure sporting grounds where acts of racism are clearly outlawed. At the very least, they must ensure that there is accountability for racist offenses. And of course, we had both the FIFA head and UEFA head at these discussions. Let me move now to the internet, which is still a scary phenomenon for people of my age. So I'd like to turn now to a very complex range of human rights challenges related to what is perhaps the most powerful global trend in recent history. That's the internet. Unquestionably, this sudden new access to information and expression is primarily a force for good. The internet has obliterated attempts to establish monopolies over information and the news. Its multiple sources boost informed decision-making by citizens and leaders, and it hugely increases pressure for transparency and for accountability. The internet can also empower individuals, even the most disadvantaged, to assert their rights and to participate in opposing oppression. Moreover, it connects citizens to a wide range of resources, notably education, but also improving access to healthcare and economic opportunities. As part of their obligation to respect the rights to freedom of opinion and expression, all states have a duty to facilitate access to the internet. Except under a few very exceptional and limited circumstances prescribed by international human rights law, and I will return to this topic in a moment because it is an important one, there must be as little restriction as possible to its free flow of information. Last year, my office convened a panel discussion regarding freedom of expression on the internet. We heard from Google, who were present, that in 25 out of the 150 countries where Google operated, one or other of its products were either banned or blocked. This is a worrisome trend. States may not prevent access to websites because they display opinions or beliefs that are critical of governments or established systems of thought. It is a fact that violators of human rights operate best under the cloak of darkness, ignorance, and silence. The internet provides exposure to the light of day. Cell phone cameras, Geospatial technology and other developments in communications technology can be used to highlight and track attacks against civilians and movements of families displaced from their homes. These images communicate the facts of human rights violations. They alert the conscience of mankind. And I am extremely distressed on how many bloggers and people who set out their opinions on the internet have been charged, sentenced to terms of imprisonment, and many opponents who are critical of government and express an opinion that all of you would freely express here in South Africa, but they are sentenced to huge terms of imprisonment. These include opposition parliamentarians and journalists. So it's a matter of grave concern that we look after the right of freedom of expression on the internet as well as in our daily lives. Now, I have to acknowledge, though, that these same communications devices can also be used as tools to monitor, locate, and target individuals who disseminate information that is critical of their governments. We must be mindful of the need to stand very firmly against this surveillance, particularly in the case of vulnerable human rights defenders. Surveillance software is also widely available to individuals, and this practice of cyber stalking also has the potential to violate rights to privacy, among other rights. In general, the intimacy and ubiquity of smartphone devices, which nestle in our pockets wherever we go, mean that a vast amount of personal information is now available online. Some of this information relates to data we have deliberately uploaded, for example, via social networks. Other bodies of personal information regarding our location, our interests, and relationships may have been harvested via cookies that operate without our conscious knowledge. Who has access to this pool termed big data? Whether and how it is stored, and the question of the consumer's informed consent to its use all raise serious concerns related to the right to privacy. For there is a dark side to the internet, and it would be foolish to ignore that amid our celebration of its many benefits. Cybercrime is a growing challenge. In many cases, criminals are exploiting the speed, convenience, and anonymity of modern technology to commit a range of already existing crimes such as fraud, trafficking of persons, or the sale of pornographic images of children. Other aspects involve entirely new forms of criminality evolving within the online environment. Phishing, hacking, identity thefts, and viral attacks against computer data systems, including for vital installations such as power plants, electric grids, and the computer systems of government. And some of you may have noted, as I did, that NATO has recently sought guidance regarding international law in cyber warfare. A number of the independent experts that NATO has been working with have drawn up an advisory manual, and its proposals make it clear that something many of us wish would remain among the fantasies of science fiction could soon, and indeed may already, be very real. Building on existing international humanitarian law, these proposals allow cyber attacks on computer systems, except those of hospitals, dams, and power stations, and also include the notion that despite being civilians, computer hackers who take part in online attacks could be viewed as legitimate targets. The human rights aspects of these potential new developments in cyber warfare are obviously an important question that will need to be addressed. And I heard from the acting Vice-Chancellor right now what a leading university WITS is. So I throw you the challenge to address these new forms of what may well be suppression of freedom of expression and human rights violations. Now, in addition to international humanitarian law, whenever it is pertinent, we must insist that human rights norms and obligations must apply wherever a government's actions deliberately target essential human rights-related services, such as healthcare facilities, education capacities, or energy services necessary for safe housing, and also whenever targets could endanger the right to health or the right to life. Moreover, if governments do not exercise due diligence and take reasonable steps to protect against attacks by third parties, human rights standards must also have a strong protective role to play. Now, regarding cybercrime and cybersecurity, the notion of security must include not just the security of assets and of the cyber environment, but also protection of users and subjects. Human rights must be protected both from cybercrime and from abusive enforcement. All measures carried out in the context of cybercrime and cybersecurity must be undertaken in full conformity with international human rights standards, including those applicable to freedom of expression, information, opinion, association, privacy rights, the dissemination of hate speech, racism and xenophobia, child pornography, and abuse and trafficking in persons. So from this rapid tour of some of the human rights challenges that have already been raised by our new online environment, we can see that there is no reason to suppose that the internet will spontaneously evolve to become any more ethical than the real world. And there is also no reason why the rules of behavior should be different online than offline. But bringing the rule of law to cyberspace may be an arduous enterprise. Certainly, it will involve a number of actors, including non-governmental bodies, including academic institutions. And paradoxically, although I have emphasized that the internet should be considered a space of freedom of expression, that effort will include restricting certain types of information or expression that may be found online. International law, as we've seen, prohibits certain kinds of expression in order to respect the rights of others. They include direct and public incitement to commit genocide, as well as advocacy of national, racial, or religious hatred that constitutes incitement to discrimination, hostility, or violence. The prohibition on child pornography is another example. Incitement to terrorism is yet another very challenging topic that may involve significant controversy. Security Council Resolution 1624 of 2005 has called upon states to prohibit by law incitement to commit a terrorist act or acts and to prevent such conduct. However, states have a broad margin of discretionary power to interpret what kinds of expression constitute incitement to terrorism, and this may be open to misuse. International human rights law lays down a number of criteria for restrictions to the right to freedom of expression. They must be defined by law in terms clear enough to enable people to regulate their conduct accordingly. They must be necessary and proportionate, which means, among other things, that the state must carefully assess whether there is a direct and immediate connection between the restricted speech and the threat. Restrictions need to involve effective safeguards, including oversight by an independent and impartial body, and they must be precise. Blocking and filtering technology must not be deployed to obstruct access to critical scrutiny. And of course, the United Nations has developed criteria for what is allowed under counterterrorism measures, because these cannot be excessive either. None of us can really know what the future holds. I'm simply trying to map out a few of the difficult issues that seem likely to lie ahead. And as I do this, I think it becomes clear that when we extend human rights protection into these very challenging new areas, we will be able to employ the landmarks that we've already achieved. We can hold violators to account using the international human rights standards that have been slotted into place over the past 65 years. So our journey so far has provided us precisely with the skills and tools that we will need in the future as we continue our work to protect the rights and dignity of all. And I look forward to your ideas and suggestions as I continue to carry out my task. Thank you very much for your attention.